This is Block 9, the liberal establishment. Section 6, the civil rights movement, with the section beginning Medgar Evers. Despite King's stirring words and the night of the speech itself, Medgar Evers, the man on the left, was a civil rights worker in Mississippi, was murdered by a mob of Klansmen. His death made front-page news. A month later, these four little girls in the picture on the right were going to Sunday school. They went to Sunday school, and their preacher taught them a lesson about Christ's teaching to turn the other cheek when violence is done against you. And on their way out of church, on their way home, these four little girls were killed when a bomb went off in their church. A bomb set off by these vicious Southern racists who would kill little girls so they could, continue to engage in their practices and their beliefs. These violent actions led most Americans to get behind a civil rights bill. This stuff was on the news every night, and most Americans, even if they're not the biggest fan of black people in general, don't like to see, four little girls being blown up by Americans. Four little American girls being blown up by other Americans down in Mississippi. Most Americans, and many Southerners, that, even Southerners started to say, many of them started to say, look, that the violence is not doing anybody any good. Many Southerners were disgusted. Most Americans and many Southerners were disgusted by the violence. It made every argument that America made against the Soviet Union seem hollow. That how can a country that on the international stage stands for, freedom and liberty and opportunity, deny it so obviously and so violently to blacks in the South? That if Americans rightfully say that the Soviet Union is a police state, where people who disagree with the government are sent to labor camps and work camps in the Gulag, the Soviet Union could respond that the American South was a police tyranny, where little girls were murdered, by their own countrymen as they left, the study of the nonviolence of Christ. And it just makes the United States look bad, and it pricks the consciences of most Americans. And more and more Americans start to call up their congressmen and say, get behind a civil rights bill, that we don't want to see this on the evening news anymore. Something has to be done. But Congress is still not moving quickly. That the Congress that was elected in 1962 is, has a bare Democratic majority. The Democrat majority is dependent on Southern Democrats. And blacks themselves begin to get frustrated at the slow pace of change. That the optimism that was so obvious in the late 50s and early 60s begins to give way to anger. And Martin Luther King, even in his speech, in Washington, warns black America against, resorting to anger. He says we have to meet physical force with soul force, with the force of the soul, with the teachings of Christ. But to many blacks, especially younger blacks, this is no longer an acceptable thing. That the political changes that were their right were not being passed. That the representatives of the people of the United States were not responding to their peaceful marches, to their peaceful protests, to the calls of Dr. King. Black nationalism began to grow more and more popular under leaders like Malcolm X. The Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad began being more powerful voices. That the voice of Dr. King was now joined by a chorus of critics in the black community who said that Dr. King's Christian approach is not an approach that's going to be effective. And the civil rights movement begins to split just as it is on the cusp of its greatest successes. King's legacy of peaceful protest and working with white America seemed at risk, and then everything changed when Kennedy was assassinated.